in behavioral health,
Wow.
the normie here is, Umberto, is people only collect 13 to 15% of what they're owed. So how many
Mm.
businesses, how many industries are you aware of where 20 to 25% of your revenue could go unpaid and that business could still be sustainable? If you cater to the patient's financial experience as much as you do the clinical, you're creating a more holistic, positive experience with your operation. You become the first place they refer business to, not the last, when you do the financial experience the right way.
Welcome to the Brainwaves podcast by Opus, where we sit down with industry leaders to unpack their journeys, explore their latest trends, talk about how they're shaping the future of behavioral health and healthcare technology. I'm your host, Humberto Bugnotto, the CEO of Opus, and today we have an absolute powerhouse in the world of healthcare finance joining us, and I'm really excited to have him. Our guest today is Christopher Wolfington, who is a serial entrepreneur and investor and fintech innovator who has spent over 2 decades transforming the way healthcare providers approach patient financial management and revenue cycle management. He's been at the forefront of financial technology, founding and leading multiple companies that help healthcare organizations simplify payments, improve access to care, mitigate inducement compliance, and reduce financial stress and friction for patients. Chris is the founder and chief revenue and strategy officer of FinPay, a company that's redefining patient financial engagement by ensuring affordability, transparency, and trust in the payment process. With deep background in finance, technology, and risk management, Christopher has been a driving force in making healthcare payments smarter, smoother, and more patient friendly. I've personally known Chris for about 2 years, but I've known of him for almost a decade since I started working in the industry in behavioral health. Chris is known for his expertise in behavioral health in the behavioral health industry and his irreverent, no bullshit approach to patient financial management and solving problems in our space. Chris, welcome to the Brainwaves podcast by Opus. I'm excited to have you here.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Umberto. I only wish my kids introduced me the same way. I would actually sound important to them. So I appreciate that intro. Thank you.
It's it's a long bona fides, and you do have a long history in the industry, and I'm excited to have you here to kind of explore your background, the impact you've been having in the industry. So why don't we start there? I know you founded and exited several companies, so I'd love to hear more about that history and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Gotcha. Yeah, so by definition, I'm definitely a serial entrepreneur. FinPay is my seventh company I started. Most of them, if not all of them, have been centered around consumer payments in one form or another. And healthcare came on my radar, much like a lot of innovation comes on somebody's radar. They have a personal experience, and it's usually a personal experience that is baffling or frustrating or even, instills frustration. And mine was no different in that regard. I had a couple healthcare experiences with family members, some related to behavioral health, some not. That the financial experience that I went through, I literally walked away going, me personally having 35 years of consumer facing payments businesses, going, there's no possible way that's how healthcare manages the financial experience for patients. And so I do what any entrepreneur does. I started looking and researching. And what I came across, and I'm going to use last year's numbers because they weren't as high, 7 years ago when I started the company. But last year there were 490 billion with a B, $billion in deductibles, copays, and
Wow.
coinsurance that patients owed as part of the cost sharing when they use their healthcare. So when people say to me, what does FinPay do? I say it helps make healthcare more affordable for patients. And that being the case, people always say, well, how do you do that? I always say it just starts with using common sense and transparency and being more upfront about cost and help people navigate the confusion that often centers around healthcare cost. And another way of saying that
Mm-hmm.
is the financial literacy around healthcare costs in the United States is literally zero. Doesn't discriminate with age, income, education, where you live. Harvard graduates or someone with a high school education or less really, they just don't understand. It's one thing to say you owe something. It's another thing to say, how did you, why do I owe it? And how did you get the number? And then when you couple that confusion and lack of financial literacy with the idea that think about the way healthcare handles the financial experience in most cases. I go in, I get some healthcare encounter, and then what ends up happening is no one says anything about the money except physicians, because it's only $20 at the front desk, right? It's a $20 copay, $60 copay for a specialist or whatnot. And so what ends up happening outside of that type of encounter is I get my health care and nobody ever says anything to me, right? And at that point, 2 months later, I get a bill in the mail. And in behavioral health, what makes that very challenging, it's not just a bill, it's a $2,500 bill, it's a $5,000 bill. It's not $60, right? And so it leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth. Like, why didn't anyone ever tell me this was coming? Like, why didn't anyone help me? And a lot of times in behavioral health, it was wink, wink, don't worry, you don't know anything, come on in. And then I still get a bill for $4,000. And if you're a family member or you're a patient that's dealing with, I don't think anyone debate the stress and fear and anxiety around this type of care, and just to throw financial stress into that mix is just unfair. And so the other thing I learned was that $490 billion in these out-of-pocket costs, less than 20% of it ever gets paid. That's all of healthcare, by the way. In behavioral health,
Wow.
the normie here is, Umberto, is people only collect 13 to 15% of what they're owed. And 10 years ago, Umberto, if I could be honest, nobody cared if the patient paid because the patient only represented 2% of the bill. Maybe you owe $500, right? But today the patient owes 25% of the bill. So how many businesses, how many industries are you aware of where 20 to 25% of your revenue could go unpaid and that business could still be sustainable? I would argue you can't. The problem is
You can't.
Yeah, you can't. And when no one's ever had to deal with this problem before or had to engage patients about cost, it's not just saying to somebody, oh, you owe $5,000. How you want to pay me today? Like that is not an experience that's consistent with the clinical care, the high level, high quality clinical care you're trying to provide a patient. And then you just drop the ball on the financial experience. And this is what I saw. This is what my research revealed. And then this is an interesting fact. In most patients' cases, their financial experience can be 3 to 5 times longer than the clinical care. What I mean by that is in behavioral health, my care encounter may be, if it's inpatient, 30 days or less, right? And and if I'm outpatient, my time on a calendar may be longer, but my actual billable days is 25, 30 days, right? The financial experience can be months and months and months and months. And so it really is suggesting that the market needs to adapt and say, hey, I need to put some quality and some transparency around how I talk to patients about cost. And that's basically how FinPay started. That was the logic, because there was a really high need and there was no automation. With no disrespect to any of the systems out there, when they were built, nobody cared about the patient paying money. So obviously, if the client doesn't
So,
care, why would the
so you're saying, 10 years ago, 2%, now it's more like 25%. How have these behavioral health operators that we both serve, how have they adapted to that? Aside from FinPay, if they don't use FinPay, if they're just kind of going through the motions, do they just write that off as a, hey, this is a nice to have, not a must have portion of my revenue?
So one of the first things I realized we had to solve for was visibility. You can't solve a problem that you can't see. And so, under the generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, as most people know, in healthcare, you report on what's called a net patient revenue basis. So, what does that mean? It means that as it relates to patient payments, you report what you're paid, not what you're owed. Like in a traditional business, if I sell furniture and I ship somebody a piece of furniture, I have a receivable on my books for, $100 chair I sold somebody. And if the guy doesn't pay me, I have $100 write-off on my P&L. In healthcare and behavioral health, it doesn't work that way. So they're only reporting in most cases what they're paid. So when I ask CEOs and CFOs every day, how much money a year do patients owe you? I literally get a blank stare. I think in 8 years, Umberto, only one person's ever been able to answer that question with any form of accuracy. I'm not saying that's anything against those people. There's no system or report that says, hey, last month you admitted 100 patients whose patient financial responsibility was $1 million and you collected 100,000 of it. The only thing they see is the 100,000 they collected. So you can't fix a problem you can't see. So the first adaptation is really having a conversation. The adapting happens when somebody starts probing and asking questions in order to help them, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then the other thing they do,
You come in. Yep.
the other thing they do that's interesting, and this is actually worse than doing nothing. They do almost all operators do a verification of benefits on the patient. And it'll tell them, hey, the remaining deductible is X, the copay is Y, the coinsurance is Z, and the max out of pocket is whatever it is. And so the only tangible number they have is the deductible. This is what I'm going to share with you, a common strategy, which I say to people, you're better off doing nothing. You're better off not having a conversation than misleading a patient, not misleading them on purpose, but by accident. In other words, if I say to you, Umberto, you're a father and your child needs substance abuse treatment, and I say to you, your deductible is $2,000, and you say, fine, and you pay me $2,000, in your mind, what are you thinking?
I'm done.
I'm done. I'm really glad that was your instinctive answer, because most people go, I'm done. So when you get a bill in the mail for another $2,800, which would be the coinsurance, what are you thinking about that provider?
Where the hell did that come from? Which is common in any. I'm sure, especially in behavioral, but pretty much in any care setting, you're always kind of wondering, is there something else coming?
Or you're saying they misled me. They bait and switched me. Why would you tell me 2 when it's 4,800? Why would you tell me it's 500 when it's really 1,500? In an effort to help the patient, the family, and you go, oh, I'm going to tell you what your deductible is, and you pay it, you think you just did a good job. What you really just did is vaporized any chance of getting a referral from that family, or God forbid their loved one needs to be readmitted due to a relapse. I don't know where they're going when their child relapses. I only know where they're not going, because their last experience with you was financial, and in their mind, you misled or lied to them. Doesn't mean you did mislead or lie to them. That's the way they feel. Does that make sense? So to us, it's about solving for visibility. The owner of a facility, if they can see the problem, they can fix it. If they have a way to know what patients owe in advance, then they can do a better job of being more transparent, more upfront. And if you cater to the patient's financial experience as much as you do the clinical, you're creating a more holistic, positive experience with your operation. And at the same time, let's use that same scenario where somebody relapses or another family member or friend needs treatment, you become the first place they refer business to, not the last, when you do the financial experience the right way.
Got it. Is there a compliance aspect of this? Because I know there are new laws in place about disclosing the amount for treatment and being upfront about how much somebody could potentially spend on treatment. And I don't know the difference between the insurance part of it and the patient financial portion of it. Is there, by doing nothing, are these operators risking putting anything at risk by simply like writing off these numbers or just kind of ignoring and hoping that they'll get, a small percentage of the patient financial portion?
So, yeah, answer is yes. And remember I said 10 years ago the patient only owed 2% of the bill and who cared, right? You wouldn't risk the 98% reimbursement you have coming from the insurance by making too much of a big deal of the 2% that was owed by the patient, right? It was so much easier to say, don't worry about it, patient. Just admit and we won't bill you for that, or, wink, wink. Or they say, oh, I can't ask them about that money because my competitor down the street's not asking them about that money. And I'm going to be uncompetitive in the marketplace if I'm honest and upfront about what their costs are. And 10 years ago, that was a common, you could even argue, acceptable practice. But since 2018, a law was passed called ECRA, it stands for the Elimination and Kickbacks in Recovery Act. And it actually makes it a criminal offense to waive or reduce any out-of-pocket costs by the patient and the family. And so it has criminal consequences, which have proven out in the last couple of years to show, because a couple of jail terms were given out for this compliance violation. What's more common though, Umberto, what's more realistic is getting claims clawed back from a payer audit. See, payers know and have known that providers routinely waive or reduce these out-of-pocket costs. And under the eyes of the law and under the guidelines of most in-network contracts, it's very specific that you are not allowed to waive or reduce out-of-pocket costs. And so payers know that a huge percentage of the market currently does not have any compliance automation or processes in place. And so one of the first things they do, I literally have a standard letter I show clients from a major payer that when they notified them of an upcoming audit, the very first section of these are the things we're going to cover was around inducement. And they wanted to see standard operating procedures. They wanted to, the provider to demonstrate that they provide a good faith estimate on cost to every patient. They wanted the provider to prove that they make 3 regular and customary collection efforts, because that's the rule.
Wow.
It's interesting. It doesn't say, hey, you have to collect X percent of what you're owed. What it says is you have to make regular and customary collection efforts. And a regular and customary collection effort is a statutorily defined term. So, for example, huge myth in this industry, massive. I would argue, of all the things we're going to talk about today, this may be the most helpful to somebody out there. Someone a long time ago told the treatment business that if you send 3 statements, service statements to a patient or a family, that counts as meeting your regular and customary collection efforts. It does not. It does not.
Why
A
not?
collection effort is because it's a statement of services. It's not a collection effort. And I'm going to use a real easy example because some people are familiar with this. So in my lifetime, I've gotten a collection letter before. And let me tell you how you know it's a collection letter, because at the very top of the document, it says the purpose of this letter is to collect a debt and any information obtained will be used for that purpose. They don't put that on there to be nice. They put that on there because that is a requirement under the law, so the consumer knows that this is a collection letter. So that counts as a collection effort. A phone call counts as a collection effort. A text that is collection in nature, not just sending somebody a text, but the content of the text is an effort to collect balances owed counts. And so keeping track of and date and time stamping and having technology that date and time stamps all these engagements, when you're in a payer audit, you go from being very subject to having claims clawed back. And I don't know if you're familiar with, not too recently ago, Aetna sued a number of treatment facilities for $250 million. And Aetna's position
Yes,
was,
I am.
look, we're not only are we not paying you for the claims that are in our system today, we want our money back from the claims from last year that we paid you where you did not follow the rules around inducement. So it's then they're getting more and more aggressive because they know there's not a lot of automation around this part of the business. Most people are trying to manage this with paper and spreadsheets. And Umberto, you know, you're in the electronic medical record business. Imagine trying to get claims paid today using paper and spreadsheets instead of having your EMR, you know, automate the charts and do all the things that your system does to help reimbursements get paid more efficiently and having the revenue cycle process go more smoothly. If they didn't have your medical records to automate that, you know, their business would, you know, the predictability of their revenue would be in jeopardy.
Yeah. No, this is, I mean, we often convert customers that are still on paper. Believe it or not, there's a significant number of treatment facilities out there, pretty good size actually. We just onboarded an account, 6 locations, 5 states, 250 clinicians. They were all on paper charts, and most of the work we're doing is digitalizing their charts into Opus. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, this is actually a good segue to what I was going to ask you about. I'm curious as to how these conversations go with the operators of a treatment facility in terms of kind of the level of sophistication that's required to even have the conversation about patient financial responsibility, right? Is this something do you find that most of the time when you have an initial conversation with an operator, small or large, that they have a roundabout idea about this because of the audits and because maybe they've been audited before, they kind of heard from their attorney, whatever? Or are they like deer in the headlights? What are you talking about? I didn't know this was such a big problem.
I'll answer that 2 ways. From a risk assessment standpoint, they always think it's the other guy that's going to get audited, them, right?
Mm,
So they think, yeah, this is something you know, they'll say, yes, this is important. But when you look at the investment or the processes they use to protect the business, you know, they're still using paper and spreadsheets. So one of the reasons why we created an electronic financial records platform, we used the same logic why you built yours, right? You have an electronic medical record
mm-hmm.
platform because you identified that the idea that I can have an electronic digital record of the patient's clinical experience, that multiple people in an organization across various departments can either contribute to that record or view that record at any time to create efficiency and automation around the process. We just took the same logic, but as it relates to the financial experience. Because what normally happens is this, to answer your question. Admissions is using, and this is unique to the behavioral health business compared to other verticals in healthcare. A CRM is necessary in this vertical because substance abuse treatment is one of the few areas in healthcare where the patient clearly needs the treatment, but you still have to convince them to get it.
Yeah.
Most
And convince the
verticals,
payers that they should pay for it.
yes, and most verticals in healthcare, the people that talk to the patients are schedulers on the front end. Like they don't have to convince Jane Doe to come in and get her shoulder operated on when she has a torn rotator cuff, right? Like Jane doesn't need convincing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In behavioral health, specifically substance abuse, the leads come in from a variety of different sources: biz development, outreach, SEO, pay per click, right? There's a lot of different marketing channels where a consumer knows that a treatment center exists and the services they provide. And so a CRM is needed to manage those different lead sources and also the way the math works, right? They have 100 phone calls come in, only 5%, 6% of those phone calls actually convert to an actual admission. And you don't want all that, what I'll call unnecessary data in the EMR, right? So they put it in a CRM, they integrate the CRM. In some cases like yours, your CRM and your EMR are one, so it makes it really easy, but that's not how the market normally is. I think that's an interesting value proposition of yours to create that seamless, CRM, EMR, communication. But you got to look at it from the standpoint that the patient's financial experience, their journey with any treatment provider isn't just during the admission. It isn't just during while they're in treatment. It isn't just post-discharge. There's different stages of the financial experience that cross over multiple departments. And so you need electronic financial record that follows that patient. So you as an operator of an organization can decide, which patients need to be engaged around cost up front, which ones do I wait until they're in treatment, and which ones do I wait until post-discharge. And if I have different employees through different departments that need to do certain tasks, A, to be compliant, and B, to collect this money that you're owed, there needs to be a system that they can go to see what still needs to be done, what conversations have already been had, what steps has the patient already taken. I think you and I both know that's an impossibility using paper and spreadsheets across multiple departments. So, a lot of these facilities, when they don't have access to electronic financial records, they either do nothing. If you ask me what's the most common strategy, the most common strategy is do nothing. Or they'll say to their admissions team, try to collect the deductible. Try being the operative word. And then that has its problems that I told you about earlier. And it's only due to a lack of automation and technology that makes doing nothing the unfortunate default strategy.
Got it. So
And I'll tell you one
for
other thing,
folks who
Alberto.
haven't heard, yeah.
I was just going to say one other thing. A lot of times a common problem is the owner of the company wants to be compliant. The owner of the company believes they provided the services, so they should collect the money they're owed. But I can't tell you how many times I run into admission teams that just don't adhere to the process. Like the owner will tell them, this is the process, this is the technology we're using, and the admission team just ignores them. Like, to me, that's mind numbing. Like, as somebody that's had 7 businesses and set up discipline and processes around everything that those companies did so we could scale, having certain employees in an area of the business just ignore what the CEO tells them to do is something that always is baffling to me.
And do you think that that's a product of, this is a very entrepreneurial field where that lots of the customers that we work with are people in recovery that decided, I went through this, it worked for me, let me go and set up a business and help other people. Do you think that that's just because these operators are kind of sort of a victim of their own success, if you will, and they're just kind of in the whirlwind of just day to day putting out fires? How do I get admissions? How do I make payroll? How do I do this? And they just didn't get to a point where they either hired somebody who has like a compliance background or somebody who can help them put these processes in place in writing, instead of them having to micromanage every person in admissions or in every other department. What do you think is the leading cause of these things just don't get followed, and then 3 years later they get an audit and they get a huge hit from the insurance company or something like that? What's the root cause there, you think?
It's a combination of a couple things. And I'm not going to put them in order because I think the order really is relevant to the individual operation, right? But I'll just spell them out. The first reason is because if anyone's been in the business for, say, 10 years, they were able as entrepreneurs to build very successful substance abuse businesses. and figure it out on the way. In other words, the out-of-network model had such great high reimbursement rates that if there were gaps in process, gaps in discipline, gaps in automation, you could still be a sustainable business even though you had profit leaks and process leaks all over your business, and fix them as they, like a whack-a-mole, right? That whack-a-mole game, as problems popped up, you try to solve them. So one of the things that's happened is there's a lot of pressure on that out-of-network model, and there has been, and it's increasing year over year. Payers, I think COVID created a lot of this. COVID created a lot of awareness by the payer community of how much money they were actually spending on behavioral health services, and they've started to realize that, holy cow, I'm paying how much for a day of detox? We're paying how much for a day of residential? And the audits started to increase. And you start seeing enforcement of inducement laws. Most of the criminal actions by the Justice Department came as a result of a payer audit and a payer reporting that operator to the Justice Department. That's part of their leverage. So that's area number one, is that this problem existed because it didn't matter 10 years ago. Second thing that's happened is, because this transition happened so fast, so not only are the payers paying more attention, but 10 years ago, you didn't have these high deductible health plans. You didn't have patients routinely owing in-network thousands and thousands of dollars, right? Like you do today. And one of the issues is, remember we talked about the systems not giving visibility. If I'm a CEO, I'm a CFO, if I can't see how much I'm owed by all these patients, how do I solve or even know I have a problem? So there aren't any subject matter experts. So normally, if somebody says, hey, I have a clinical problem in my business, well, I have a clinical director, I have a medical director. I go to that person, I say, hey, there's this problem, go solve it. That person's qualified and has the experience to go solve it. If someone has a revenue cycle issue with claims and with a particular payer and the claims they're getting, they go to the revenue cycle person who they hired, who's their in-house expert, solve this problem. So if you didn't know you had a problem with patient financial management, that means you never hired anybody that's a subject matter expert. And so where do you go inside your organization to get that guidance? So one of the things that I tell my team, and you probably have your version of this in your business, I think the best asset that these CEOs have and CFOs have is the vendors that they work with. And most of these vendor companies, the bigger ones, are run by some pretty sophisticated people that have been in their role in numerous other ventures and businesses and have vast resources, a great network of people that they know. And if I was the CEO of a treatment business today, my Rolodex of my current vendors with CEOs and C-suite members of those companies that I'm paying for various services, I would lean on them. There's probably, Umberto, one of the most valuable resources a CEO in addiction treatment has is the C-suite of the vendors they work with. And these vendors are willing to help. I mean, you and I have spoken about this, so I know you fit into this camp. If a CEO of one of your customers was having a problem with something that had nothing to do with Opus, but you had a resource or within your network someone that could help you, you and I have talked about that. You would help them with that in 2 seconds, as would I.
100%.
And
In fact, yeah, you and I had a conversation about this about a month ago, and it was probably the most insightful suggestion I've had from anyone in my circle to be useful to other customers of ours outside of the Opus realm. Just get on a conversation with a CEO of one of my customers and say, what can I do for you? Forget Opus, forget CRM, EMR, billing, all these things. I have a Rolodex of people and contacts that I think can be helpful to you. What can I do to help you? And I've had 2 of those conversations since you and I spoke, and I was able to solve a problem for both of those customers that had nothing to do with Opus. And now I have a little bit of a rapport with these customers. And of course, that's something they're going to remember. I love that you suggested that to me, and I think it's like probably one of the most invaluable pieces of advice I've had from someone. But go on, you were talking about exercising that on your side too.
Yeah, and I think it's just common sense, right? Like my cousin is a very successful guy, like very successful, self-made. He could arguably be a billionaire. I mean, he's a very successful guy. And he said to me, I remember it was like 2020, 5 years ago, he said two things. He said, Chris, the more successful you get, the smaller your group of authentic friends gets. The second thing he said, more relevant to this conversation, was always remember the guy in charge is where everybody goes to get answers to questions. But where does he go to get the answer to his question? And the common answer might be, you have legal and accounting, but okay, so what if it's not a legal or accounting question? What if it's just a
Yeah.
fundamental business question? And so I would recommend, if I'm a CEO, CFO of a treatment business and I'm spending a lot of money in technology and services and all these other things that make up your P&L, I literally would, have conversations with the C-suite of those vendors and make sure that I had access to them, because think of how many treatment facilities they speak to. Like I'm FinPay. I'm speaking to hundreds of treatment facilities. In those conversations, I'm hearing everything around their marketing strategies and their challenges on admissions and their challenges on length of stay and their challenges of AMA risk and some common challenges that all of these businesses have. Yet you and I get to hear all the different variety of strategies that different people are using to solve these. So think of, Umberto, what that means. You have this wealth of knowledge and information just from your day-to-day interactions with the market that could be highly useful. And even though it has nothing to do with Opus, I think you and I, and everyone else in our position in our organizations, we have if we really mean what we say when we talk to customers, we have an obligation. I'm going to call it an obligation. We have an obligation to make our resources available to our customers, even if it has nothing to do with what we do for a living on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And I think the whole industry would benefit from that, because the smarter, more efficient, more automated, more transparent, more mature the market gets, the better it is for all the stakeholders, including us.
Yeah, and I think this industry, we're sort of uniquely positioned to be in the business of helping each other because just of the nature of recovery, right? It is a very it's a group activity. It's when you think about people in recovery and behavioral health, you don't go down this road on your own. It's very much a I'll help you, you help me. So it's in the nature of most of the operators in our space to be helpful to others. So it's only natural for us to practice that. And I love that idea. Let me ask you this. Entrepreneurs like you often succeed because they focus on what matters most. What was the defining moment for you when you decided to prioritize patient financial management? And that would be the biggest impact you could make in the behavioral health space or in healthcare in general. When did you realize this is the thing I got to focus on? Because you obviously, having started multiple companies over the years, you must have ideas that pop in your brain all the time, like I do. So when did you realize, okay, this is the thing that I'm going to put my blood, sweat, and tears into?
It was those couple of healthcare experiences after I did that research. So I had a couple family members that one was my son had his ACL torn, and literally a very prominent orthopedics group, like from a clinical standpoint, they're at the top of their game. Financially, they call up this 24-year-old kid. They mention to him vaguely that he may owe money for his out-of-pocket costs. And it's the day before his surgery. No one's talked to him. My son's panicking. He's like, what's going on? I call them up on his behalf. They're like, oh, yeah, he's going to owe $2,800. I said, well, when were you going to tell him that? They said, oh, he's on our list to call this afternoon. I said, but his surgery's tomorrow. Like, so you're going to call somebody 12 hours before surgery,
Yep.
24 years
High
old, that they owe
anxiety.
28 that they owe $2,800. I go, well, what are his options for paying that? They go, well, he doesn't have any. You got to pay $2,800. So I said, well, yeah, he has an option. I think we're going to go find ourselves a different doctor because that is
Mm-hmm.
absurd that you would do that to somebody. Now, imagine that substance abuse. I
Yep.
have a
Oh my God.
child who is addicted to drugs and alcohol. And I have all the fears as a parent that have nothing to do with money. And then you throw gas on that fire by making the cost this big pink elephant in the room, and no one's talking about it. No one's helping me navigate it. No one's telling me what it is. I mean, you're creating a firestorm. And then what's one of the leading causes of relapse? Financial stress. So what
Mm.
everybody does is they don't talk about the money, and then they send the patient a bill for 4 grand 2 months after they get out of treatment. I mean, you're in essence recreating the very thing you just spent 30 days trying to treat. I mean, it's
Yeah,
absurd.
which is absurd because there's so much emphasis on outcomes and post-treatment focus to make sure that somebody doesn't relapse. The relapse rates are, I think 7% is the last number, is the number of patients that do not relapse. So 93% of them do relapse in substance use. It's insane to think that there's so much focus on the outcomes part of things, but the most anxiety driving activity you can do is sending somebody a $4,000 bill, yet that's what's happening.
And here's the upsetting part. It's avoidable. Ready? So let me give you an example. So we did a study of all of our patients, 200,000 plus on our platform, and a $500 million with a B dollars of risk that we've managed for our customers. And here's some interesting things we learned. When you discuss cost, not tell them what the cost is, but have a transparent conversation, and I'll address that in a second. When you do that pre-admission, you'll get 76% of the money you're owed paid instead of 15%. The patient satisfaction score across all those 100 plus facilities that are on our system was over 97%. So think about that. People think talking about money with patients is like taboo and don't do it. The guy down the street's not doing it. So I shouldn't do it because, I'm going to lose the admission,
Yeah.
right? That is the biggest myth and cop out I've ever heard. And if I'm a CEO and I ever
Mm.
hear an admissions person tell me that, I have the wrong admissions person. Because here's the math. You get paid 76% of what you're owed. The patient satisfaction scores on pre-admission cost engagement is 97% or better. And here's the thing I never expected. The average length of stay is longer. Inpatient, the average length of stay is 3.05 days longer, and outpatient is 5.1 billable sessions longer. And though I can't quantify why, I have some pretty good logic. If you go into treatment, or your child does, and there's no fear and anxiety or concern around cost because you've already have taken care of it, and the provider has made it easy for you, why would you leave early?
Yeah.
And the answer is you wouldn't.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. There must be some portion of somebody's wanting to stay in treatment that has to do with how much of a burden is this putting on my family, because maybe my parents are paying for it, or maybe if another family member or a spouse or somebody like that. There must be, I hadn't actually thought about it from that perspective. That's what you're saying, right? Is somebody's there, they got to be there for 30 days. I got to get out of here as soon as possible because this is costing X dollars per day, and that's going to put my family under.
And everyone thinks of AMA risk in clinical terms. A patient leaves against medical advice for
Hmm.
some clinical reason, or they're just whatever. A significant portion is due to financial AMA risk. Someone shows
Mm.
up, they admit, and they drop a bomb on them about money, and the person's like, "You never told me that. Like, why'd you lie to me? I'm out of here." or as part of verifying their benefits, they wait to do what's called a live VOB when the person's already in treatment, and then they find out that the insurance coverage is somewhat lacking and there's this big amount due and they leave. It's so much easier to do the transaction right. And let me define what that means, because I don't think anyone listening to this, I don't want them to be confused. Umberto, if you owed $5,000, the right conversation is, hi, Umberto. Oh, you're going to admit to our treatment center. That's great. Umberto, according to your insurance, you're going to owe $5,000. How are you going to pay that today? Now, that's not the way you handle the conversation. The conversation is, if I'm an admissions person, within the first 30 seconds of the call, I say, Umberto, you haven't asked me yet, but one of the things every patient asks me eventually is, what about my insurance? How much is this going to cost me? And it's a good thing that you called us here at ABC Treatment, because we have a department, a group of engagement specialists whose only job it is to answer all your questions about your insurance, all your questions about cost, and help you navigate your cost for treatment. Because when you come here, the only thing we want you worrying about is getting well. So if you let me ask you a couple questions to make sure our programs are aligned with what your needs are, I can get you over to that team after you and I get through some of these questions, and they can help you answer any questions you have. And think about what I just did. Everybody knows they owe money. It's a big pink elephant in the room. I, as the treatment facility, establish credibility when I bring it up first.
Yeah.
Then when you when you have a dedicated person who's been trained, this is one of the things we do, on how to have the right financial conversation with a patient, you get those high satisfaction scores in the collections I mentioned. And this is what I mean by a right conversation. And I'm going to paraphrase. Hi, Umberto. I'm your engagement specialist. And here at ABC Recovery, we care not only about your physical health, but we care about your financial health as well. My role as your engagement specialist is to help you understand what you might owe for treatment, why you owe it, how the amount was determined. I think it's really important to understand, Umberto, that here at ABC Recovery, we do not determine what you owe for your treatment. I see you have Aetna. Your Aetna policy determines what you owe. We have nothing to do with that determination. However, I want to help you navigate your costs that Aetna is saying you have to pay. And so, for example, Umberto, a lot of people get frustrated and confused by all the paperwork that they receive during the billing and claims process. I don't want you to have any frustration, Umberto. Do you mind if I take 60 seconds and explain what all that paperwork means so you and your family don't get frustrated? And I've listened to the calls, Umberto. Everyone says yes. And so you explain the billing and claims process. You explain the EOB and why the EOB says one thing and the statement from the provider says another. And then I say to you, Umberto, at ABC Recovery, we don't want you to pay any more than you have to. And there's a couple things that you can do to save costs for treatment. Do you mind if I take a minute and explain some of those things that you can do? Of course, they all say yes. And you explain to them what an HSA is and an FSA and these other, tax advantage things that they could use. And then I say, Umberto, most people find healthcare costs to be confusing, and some people understand their insurance policies and some don't. But just so you don't worry about anything, do you mind if I take a couple seconds and explain how your specific insurance policy works? Of course, you say yes. Now, Umberto, what have I not done? I paraphrase this
You have
conversation,
not
but
hid
have you noticed?
from them, and yeah, you're not. It's the difference between buying something online or showing up to a car dealership where you worry about them throwing in the mats and the accessories and the things, and before you know, you think you're buying something for 10,000, it's 15,000, and you don't know why, because there's like this complex thing that they send you at the
Yeah.
end, and then they send you to the manager. That's the experience that people are used to, right? What you're selling is, we're being as upfront as possible, and it's not us. This is what the cost is. There's no hidden fees.
And not only that, but in those things I just said, what's the one thing I didn't ask you for? The money. Like, I
Yeah.
haven't asked you to pay anything yet. What I've done is I've helped you, helped you, helped you. very consistent with how the admissions rep was helping you, was compassionate. And right now, everything you're thinking about ABC Recovery is they help me, whether I'm a patient or a family member. And so by the time I get to the money, this isn't about you owe me $5,000, how you going to pay it today. It's I've helped you with all these things. Now let me make the treatment affordable to you. Let me tell you what your options are.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what our financial clearance policies are. But now that I've done that after I've helped you with things that are universally stress areas for anyone that's dealt with healthcare. And now all of a sudden, because I've taken a couple extra minutes to do it right up front, think of all the chaos I've avoided for other coworkers and other departments that normally have to chase patients down, hound them. You owe me money. We sent you a statement. Why didn't you pass? All of that is vaporized. When you slow down, use automation and technology to have the right conversation with the right type of patient. Because I need to talk to a self-pay patient differently than I do an in-network patient. I need to speak to an out-of-network patient differently than I do the other two. And having software that can help you segment the patient so you can have the right financial engagement is why electronic financial records are so valuable. Just like your EMR makes the right clinical engagements right. When the clinician's adding the right notes based on the care that they need and seeing the diagnosis and making sure the care plan's right. Like, imagine if they didn't have Opus to do that. Like, the chaos. And all the notes are on some clinician's notepad that nobody else in the organization can see. My God, that would be a mind-numbing effort to try to make that process work efficiently at scale. And so the financial experience is no different. And that's when I knew we were onto something, to answer your question ultimately. We were onto something when I realized, like, wow, if you had an electronic financial record that could follow that patient from pre-admission all the way through post-discharge, and anyone in the organization across any department could contribute to that record, could do their task, always knowing what their coworker already did or didn't do, so it creates this seamless experience for the patient and the family. Wow, I can get paid. They'll love me for it. And I will increase my likelihood of an alumni readmission or referral. Like, hello, that's like the triple crown. All because I slowed down and I did it right up front.
Yeah. As with most highly successful companies, building something from personal experience, from your son having to go through that episode with his surgery. Most successful companies I know were created from personal experience, and somebody just like you sat there and said, there's got to be a better way that I can do this, right? That's how FinPay was born, essentially.
And not only that, there's a lot. I've been in consumer payments for 35 years, and there's a common statistic that says any unplanned financial obligation over $400 will have a material impact on the majority of the US households. This isn't a $400 unplanned obligation. This is a multi-$1,000 unplanned financial obligation. And if you leave it to that patient or family to navigate that on their own without providing any transparency and assistance, you know who's going to be the brand that wins in your market? Isn't the person that just provides the best clinical care. It's the person who gets the reputation that knows that cost never becomes a barrier because this particular treatment facility is, has, people that are there, their sole purpose is to help the family navigate the cost for treatment. And they made it easy for me and they help relieve my stress. So think about the power, and I'm going to use the word power very specifically. The treatment facility that relieves the stress, anxiety, and fear associated with the substance abuse admission, both clinically and financially, is the winning brand. Because when you relieve that stress, I can't even begin to tell you, especially if it's a parent, right? A family member that's managing this on behalf of the patient. The value of that is immeasurable. You cannot measure it. And if you are the brand that relieves that stress and anxiety and fear, you're the brand that wins.
Mm. Yeah,
That's a
I agree
fact.
100%. Well,
And
it
people
it
spend
it
so
sounds
much
like
money.
I'm guessing. Yeah.
People spend so much money in marketing, right? If you're out of network, you're spending 5 to 10 grand CPA. If you're in network, you're spending $2 to $2,500. And the most valuable admission you have is the patient you've already treated.
Mm.
Their referral sources. You already mentioned the relapse rate, how incredibly high it is. You know what the CPA is on an alumni readmission? Zero.
No.
You know what the conversion rate is on alumni readmissions when they call the call center? It's 50%, it's 75% compared to only 5% conversion rate for a cold lead. And it's
Mm.
25% more profitable if it's in the same plan year. So think about that. I have a source that has no CPA, is more profitable, and converts at 10 times the rate. Would you ever have a process in your business that would do anything to create a barrier for that customer? And yet
Yeah.
people are sending statements home for thousands of dollars that no one helped them with every day. You might as well, light a fuse and a bomb against your alumni strategy because you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when we were talking earlier before starting the podcast, I had a feeling we were going to have to talk that this was going to be too short of a podcast because every time you and I get to talk, it ends up being a long conversation. You're such
Well,
an
I love
interesting
this
guy and
stuff.
you have such an interesting perspective on everything. So it sounds like I'm guessing that once we post this, people are going to be wanting to for us to record a second episode. So let's get ready for that. I think
Yeah.
it was really interesting to kind of learn from because it's kind of a like when I first found out about FinPay, I was like, you got to be like, this is a no-brainer. Nobody should be questioning whether they need this. It's just a matter of like, how soon can I get it in place? So I think on our next episode, we need to dive deeper into like the nuts and bolts of how it actually works. But before we go, because we both got to run businesses and do things, I'm sure
Yep.
you're traveling, so you got to go see customers. I have two more questions for you. The first one
Sure.
is if you could go back to the rookie Christopher, back in when you starting companies a few years ago, what's the one piece of advice about focusing on sort of vital few things that create the biggest results? What would that be?
So I have a couple mantras I use. These two go together. Fail fast and don't be afraid to fail. If you haven't failed, you're not trying hard enough. That's the way I look at it. Number one. Number two, I always say the
Yep.
answer is always no unless you ask. So if you want something, if you need something, ask for it. And if the answer is no, you're right back where you started anyway. So who cares? I would also say that, you know what, it's off topic, but faith,
Mm,
faith. I would wish the younger version of me had the faith I have today. Man,
mm,
the fear, the worry that used to drag me down would have been irrelevant if I had the faith then as I have today. And it might seem
mm,
corny in a business conversation, but I believe we are all here for a purpose. And every time something bad happens to you, recognize that most great things that happen in your life, if you trace the seed, the lineage back to how it started, it's usually something horrible because pain is a
yeah.
catalyst for change, whether you like it or not. And
Mm,
for me, it always got me into a good place. So I would say find a faith, hold on to it, and believe in it. And if you do what you love, and that translates. You were talking about like we have other things to do and we could keep talking forever. I get because I love it. I literally wake up
I
every
know.
day. No two
I
days
do
are the
too.
same. And I love this business. I have a lot of personal experiences. I didn't say this before, but I've been in recovery for a long time. So I personally went through this journey. And so I know what it's like to be a patient. I know what it's like to be a parent. I felt all the fears that we're talking about, right? Like I've lived them personally. That doesn't mean I was a business person first. So that's why I'm able to bring some, connect those two dots, right?
Yeah.
Before that
Real value.
happened. But Yeah.
Nice. I love that. One more question. What books are you reading that you would recommend to people listening to this?
So I think I had it right here. What was it? The one is called In Line to the Faith Comment. It's called The Awe
Nice.
of God. My daughter recommended it to me. I'm very blessed. I have a daughter who has a spiritual and moral compass that is true north and never deviates. I don't know how that happened. And she recommended the book to me, and it's been an incredible read. I'm also a big fan of The Road Less Traveled. It's old, it's been around for a while, by Scott Peck. Highly, highly recommend that. And then, as a general rule of thumb, the most interesting reads for casual reading have always been for me biographies about Revolutionary era, founding father figures. We
Mm,
had some amazing men that built our country. And it is
yeah.
amazing to me how smart they were. And it actually increased my faith, because there's no way someone's going to convince me that it was an accident that the magnitude of smart people got together at the exact time that they did, that created one of the greatest political experiments in world history.
And
So I
timely
read a lot
because there's
about.
so much division now with the political kind of climate. So probably a timely book for anyone to pick up, right?
Hey, you want to hear a fun fact on that note? If you
Yeah.
think the political divide is bad today, so most people
Mm,
think of Thomas Jefferson as a founding father, Declaration of Independence, everything great. He has two black marks on his resume. One is obviously a slave owner. The other is when he was the Secretary of State in the very first administration, George Washington's administration, he used government
hmm
money to hire a translator who wasn't a translator, was actually a publisher who published pamphlets that went against Washington's Federalist policies. So the
mm,
very first administration had a Secretary of State who used government money to pay for fake news against George Washington's Federalist policies, because Thomas Jefferson was a states' rights guy. And back then, that was a huge divide. You were either a Federalist or you were a states' right
hmm
guy. Um,
Yeah.
and most people don't know that. I only learned that by reading multiple biographies on Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. And I think I love that because I think, we tend to think, I think we probably look back only a few years in terms of history politically, and we don't remember that we've been here before, not just politically, but just in life. Things have happened. It's cyclical. History does repeat
Yeah.
itself often. So it's very easy, especially now in the world of social media and over information, to think, oh my God, everything is on fire. And it's really not the case. Like we live in the most amazing time ever by basically all metrics. It's the most amazing time to live right now. And so the idea that everything's on fire, or Trump, Biden, and Kamala and whatever, is nonsense, because to your point, things have been unfolding in unorthodox ways for hundreds of years.
Well, not only that, think about it.
And that's what
Alexander
makes the
Hamilton.
US what it is, like this
Yeah.
amazing experiment that you're referring to.
I remember Alexander Hamilton died because he lost a duel to Aaron Burr that started off a political dispute. So I guess as long as we don't go back to that, we should be okay.
Sure. Good. All right. So let's wrap up with where can people connect with you and learn more about FinPay, and how FinPay can be a resource to them.
So obviously, www.finpay.com has a lot of good information. I do a lot of speaking at various conferences. I'm going to be at the BASE conference in Florida, which is next week in Miami. And also my email
I'll see you
address
there.
is cw@finpay.com. That's my initials, cw@finpay.com. And I love these conversations. So even anybody that's intellectually curious to, parts of what we talked about, I love having these types of conversations, because I think that's where great ideas and great collaboration comes from, is when people bring their individual experience and perspectives to conversation. It typically produces some type of innovation or thought leadership. So I welcome that from anyone that may be listening to this podcast that just wants to talk about the topic.
Awesome. I do too. And I think I'm glad to have you as our first guest because we set the bar really high for future guests. I think they're going to be a little bit anxious to be a follow to follow you after this. So I appreciate you making time today, Chris. I'll see you at base. I'll be there too. And
Yep.
yeah, thanks for being here today.
All right, you got it. Thanks, Alberto.
See ya.
Bye.